Part 2, 17 to 34. The Great Escape, Baby Goes Feral, are all about Anais. I often think of my life in terms of breaks in the story arc. It would make sense that the first one occurred with my parents' divorce, but it didn't. My father had declared hostility to me years before my parents split up, and I was happy that he was gone. The actual break in the storyline happened when my friend Paul died in a drunk driving accident a month before my 16th birthday. That event took away any misguided notion I had that life and death were knowable quantities that could be controlled by our own actions. The fact that my Christian friends made a point of telling me that Paul was now in hell confirmed this as a turning point. I was no longer the girl I had been. During the summer, when I was 16, my mother and I moved 70 miles away to Dallas so I could attend the High School for the Performing Arts. I was going to a fame school. In Dallas, I got my first taste of city life. I was a curvy teenager with extreme daddy issues, chronic depression and anxiety, undiagnosed autism, and virtually no self-esteem. As might be expected, I began to go a bit feral, and it was reflected in my Taliswomen. I quit high school during my junior year, but remained bookish in my own feral way. I spent a lot of time in museums and libraries between enduring tortured affairs with long-haired guitar players and the occasional drummer. I wrote bad, overwrought poetry. One byproduct of my brief attendance at a city high school with feminist teachers, I discovered canonical women writers whose work, to my surprise as an arrogant teenager, moved me. There was Mary Shelley. I was stunned by the youth and romantic drama. Emily Dickinson. I was stunned by the quirk. And Jane Austen. I was stunned by the low-key snark. And there was Anais Nin. When I was 17, a 24-year-old waiter in a restaurant where I worked as a hostess took me on a date to see the very adult film Henry and June. That was my introduction to Anais Nin. She became my obsession and was the Taliswoman who would set the tone for the next portion of my life. When I was 19, I moved for one summer to San Francisco, where I squatted with some other kids in a decrepit Victorian in Lower Haight and mooned among the eucalyptus trees in Golden Gate Park, dramatically sadder than ever before, feeling chronically misunderstood and victimized by the world. But for the first time, another young woman introduced me to a Taliswoman of hers, Ani DeFranco. She became one of my own, and my first somewhat androgynous, not overtly feminine, Taliswoman. Back in Texas and feeling utterly defeated at 19, I went to community college for 2 years. I worked at restaurants and bookstores and loved school but hated life generally. A community college class introduced me to Virginia Woolf. I'd never read anything like To the Lighthouse, and I was enchanted. The depth of her sadness seemed to match my own, and her words wove magic incantations in my brain. She became one of my most important Taliswomen. In 1994, I began attending the University of Texas. I majored in English and took classes in women's literature, where I met my still best friend Kate and my dear friend Sarah, who died in her 20s. That was also when I began writing professionally. I wrote about arts and entertainment for the Daily Texan, UT's daily newspaper. While the other student journalists fought over the opportunity to write about bands and the live music capital of the world, I only wanted to write about books and theater. While working at the Daily Texan, I discovered Judy Chicago's Dinner Party. A book about the epic art piece had arrived in the weekly to-be-reviewed pile. The Dinner Party provided my first framework for considering my Taliswomen as a whole rather than as distinct individuals, and Judy Chicago became one of my Taliswomen. The dichotomy of sparkly versus serious that had so neatly divided my Taliswomen in childhood had shifted. It seemed to me that my Taliswomen of this new era were all very serious, or at least their art was, even when they sparkled. These women were powerhouses, and they were anything but conventional. When these Taliswomen wore sequins, they somehow wore them ironically. At once reveling in and critiquing performative standards of gender, at least it seemed to me, these Taliswomen were different than those of my childhood. Janis Joplin and Anne Magnuson were some Taliswomen of this period. And in college, I was at last discovering the wealth of wisdom and creativity that exists in women of color. And in college, I was at last discovering the wealth of wisdom and creativity that exists in women of color beyond the entertainers I saw on TV. My new Taliswomen fascinated me because they were quirky and creative, not because of how attractive they were to the male gaze. These Taliswomen were Diane Keaton, Frida Kahlo, Anne Rice. What did that mean for me? I knew who I wasn't and who I didn't want to be. I knew vaguely who I wanted to be, but who was I? After college, life came in fits and starts. I couldn't find any sort of job that suited me, and I missed the rhythm of school. I got into a relationship with a promising young engineer because I thought I'd be safe with him. It was a horrible match, but he wasn't a bad guy, and it bought me time. I went to grad school and got an MA in art history and an MFA in creative writing. I taught yoga and moved to the Bay Area for a second time. But this time I moved with the engineer and in vastly different circumstances than I'd been in a decade before. But I was just as miserable as ever, and this time I felt trapped in a fancy cage. But my Taliswomen were always there. Women like Kathy Najimy, Lily Tomlin, and Beatrice Wood. Each seemed to appear in my life at the moment I needed them. They were like embodied messages from a loving goddess. Look, girl, they seemed to say, hold on. Here is one way of being that perhaps you haven't considered.